So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out on a weekday night. Welcome to Book Passage. I'm Dana Kelly. As always, we thank you for supporting independent bookstores like this one by being here. Again, check your cell phones if you haven't. Make sure they're on silent, turned off. If you haven't had a chance to pick up a copy of Ian's latest book, it's available at all the registers that you passed on your way in tonight. And in about an hour after some presentation and some Q&A, you'll have a chance to pick up copies. We also have some of Ian's backlist here as well, if you're interested in those. And once you pay for your books, bring them on back here, and our guest will be signing at the table next to me. This is the year of World War II. I think I have done maybe 2 or 3 events this year with stories that either nobody knew about World War II or parts of World War II that where we're filling in, the things that people haven't talked about or haven't talked much about. So tonight is the War in the Pacific, and if you've read our guest's other books, you know there's a lot of detail in here that you probably did not know, and you will know tonight, and also from reading his book. There's a lot of great reviews of this book, too. I'm just going to pick the one by Evan Thomas, who's the author of Sea of Thunder and Ike's Bluff, who says in part, "In The Conquering Tide, Ian Toll takes his place as one of the great storytellers of war. He is equally vivid and commanding, describing landing on a carrier at night, making grand strategy in Washington, and brawling a bar in Australia. He's a master. He is writing for the ages." Our guest is Ian Toll. He's a writer and independent scholar. He's the author of 3 works of American military history, of which this is the 3rd, 6 Frigates, Pacific Crucible, and The Conquering Tide. The latter 2 titles are the first 2 volumes of the nonfiction trilogy. And the concluding volume, Twilight of the Gods, War on the Western Pacific, 1944-1945, will be published in 2018. 6 Frigates was the 2007 recipient of the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award for Naval Literature, among others. And Pacific Crucible received the National California Book Award for Nonfiction in 2012. So welcome to the War in the Pacific. We couldn't think of a better guide to take you there. Here's Ian Toll.
Thank you very much, Dana, for that very generous introduction. And I, as you said, have published 3 books now. It's been 13 years that I've been doing this full time. It's amazing to think about it. Yep. A little louder? Is that okay? You know, so it's been about 4 years interval between these books, which seems like a very long time. And the contracts, as originally written, not to take you too far into the weeds of my book contracts, committed me to produce these things more at a rate of about 3 years. So I've had a real problem with deadlines. I've been, I think like Douglas Adams, who is author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books, who said, "I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound they make as they go by." And writing is a little bit like being a bear in hibernation for a long winter, and you come staggering out in the spring, and you're blinking into the sun, and it's a real pleasure after that long hibernation to find that there are so many people who have been eagerly awaiting what you've been working on. A Jesuit professor at Georgetown who taught me quite a bit about 19th century American history made a provocative point once in a lecture. He said, "Why is it that our history has been so bloody? Well, it's because all throughout history you have had men who looked at war as adventure, and they wanted to go out and have fun. And war, to many of them, is fun, or has been fun. I think we historians sometimes try to be a little too clever, and the answer is right there in front of our nose. Anytime you watch a group of young boys at play, you may get that sense that this is why our history has been so bloody. There's something to the old nursery rhyme that girls are made of sugar and spice and everything nice, and boys are made of snips and snails and puppy dogs' tails. And I'm not about to wander into the nature versus nurture debate about gender identities, but I will say that I believe that if women ran the world, there would be a lot less bloodshed." So you have to be very careful, I think, when writing about the history of the war, to avoid the temptation to slip into the mode of glorifying war for its own sake. And I have always tried to keep before me this deep understanding that war, whatever else it is inherently tragic, though sometimes necessary. And we honor the extraordinary courage and valor and sacrifice of those who fight for a cause or for a country. But we never forget that war is to be avoided, and one reason to study it is to remind ourselves how terrible it is. I live across the bridge in San Francisco. Now, many of you have probably seen the exhibit, which is on the other side of the bridge, on one of the walkways up to the pedestrian area. And it's what it is a lattice beam, a replica of the beams that hold the bridge up under Fort Point. And this particular beam had been taken over to Berkeley to the School of Engineering, and the engineers had put, using an enormous machine, 4 million pounds of pressure on this beam, and it had caused it to kind of buckle, but it had held up. And the point is that the engineers have great confidence that that bridge will stand up to anything that could possibly happen to it, which of course is a great relief to anyone living in Marin, I know. And my only fear is that Hollywood will continue to destroy that bridge every single year with another movie, and I don't know what it is about those Southern Californians and their fixation on destroying the Golden Gate Bridge and all of these big budget films. It may just be that they're jealous they don't have anything as beautiful or as useful as the Golden Gate Bridge. They've got the Hollywood sign, which never seems to get destroyed in any of the movies. The point, I'm sorry, about this lattice beam is that what war does to societies, to systems of government, to communities and to individuals is what those Berkeley engineers did to that lattice beam. You place great stress on it, and the engineers have a purpose in stress testing. They're getting information back about that lattice beam that you can't get without putting it under great stress. Well, war puts society, systems of government under stress, and therefore gives us information that we couldn't get by studying societies, systems of government in peacetime. The fascist militarist states of the Axis in World War II believed that the democracies, if you put enough stress on them, would break. And in a sense, World War II was fought on that proposition. And instead, what we found was it was the democracies that stood up under the strain, and it was the Axis authoritarian militarist model that broke. World War II was a struggle between competing visions of how to organize a society. I've spent a lot of time in my first two books, and I will spend quite a bit more in my third book, paying attention to the issues of media, press, propaganda, how the war was presented to the civilian populations of the various countries. This is a subject that I believe is very important. It has received surprisingly little attention in the literature of World War II. Why another history of the Pacific War? There's a certain amount of fatigue which I've detected, and indeed I share, with just the enormous pile of books that have been published that continue to come out every year. World War II is in a sense overpublished. If you look just at the number of books published about certainly the war in Europe, but also the war in the Pacific, the sheer number of them is rather impressive. Every aspect of the Pacific campaign has received a good deal of attention, so it certainly is a mature literature. I think what's happened, particularly in the case of the Pacific War, is that there has been a tendency to slice the subject into smaller and smaller pieces, and then to focus very deeply on those individual pieces. So what you have is relentless specialization. And what that results in over time is a literature which is very rich, but also very piecemeal. And this has been a larger problem, I think, in this world of military history. It's treated somewhat as a subgenre, perhaps even as a kind of ghetto, hermetically sealed off from other important aspects of history. It has been neglected in the halls of academia. And there are various reasons for that, perhaps because there is this lingering view that to study is to glorify. And I remember a review of Six Frigates in my first book, which was basically a friendly review, but the reviewer said Toll occasionally strays out of his lane, out of the lane that he should stay in, which is naval history, into these other areas of politics and diplomacy and even economics. Well, I agree that I do stray out of my lane. I'll continue to do that, and I will continue to do it in the future. I think the stay in your lane mentality has been a problem in military history, even more so in naval history, which has often been treated as a subgenre of a subgenre, much of it written by scholars who are in one way or another affiliated with the U.S. Navy. The Pacific War has larger dimensions which deserve our attention. The politics of the war, the diplomacy, the issues in managing a global coalition, foreign policy, social history, press and propaganda, the organization of the economy for war production, the planning for the post-war future in Asia. All of these are important subjects that are usually completely omitted in military histories of this conflict. The question of how and when and how aggressively to fight the Pacific War was very controversial. The Allies made Europe first the basis of their global strategy, and yet, and the logic of Europe first was unassailable. Virtually everyone agreed, with I think the single prominent exception of Douglas MacArthur. But Europe first stated in the abstract left a host of important subsidiary questions unresolved. Given that the Allies were going to devote the lion's share of their effort to defeating Nazi Germany, regarding Nazi Germany as the prime enemy, what exactly was the minority effort that was to be made in the Pacific? There's an enormous difference between 10% and 30%, isn't there? And does the concept of Europe first mean that you fight purely a defensive war, a kind of holding action in the Pacific pending the final defeat of Germany? Or would it be permissible under this overall scheme to begin with an early counteroffensive in the Pacific? And that is what eventually was done. These were issues that were at the heart of the relationship between Great Britain and the United States, the two primary allies. It played into the future of Western colonialism in Asia, specifically the future of the British Empire. And it was an ideological struggle, the Pacific War, between Japan's Pan-Asian vision and very effective, at least early on, propaganda looking toward Asia that had been freed of the white interloper, and propaganda, censorship, press and media coverage, as I've said, I think is an immensely important subject and plays directly into the more military considerations. I favor a style of history, which is a particular style, and I don't think it's the only way to write history. But what I like to do is to tell the story first, to bring a storyteller sensibility to this work, but do it in a way that combines a certain scholarly rigor with the storytelling approach. Ever since I first realized as a 13-year-old boy living in Tokyo that I had a real obsession with history, I've sought out authors who have been able to develop narratives that will pull you through without feeling like you have to do a lot of work. Now, as a 13-year-old boy, you really need to keep the pages going because you're not going to sustain the kind of attention that you need to push through dense and unreadable history. Histories that treat the subject with nuance, recognize the complexity, and adopt a certain scholarly rigor, but at the same time tell it a great story. Those types of histories, I think, are as rare as a unicorn. And whenever I find them, regardless of what the subject, I enjoy them a great deal. I think the scholar's approach of stating a thesis, of marshaling evidence in support of developing an argument has real power and has often the deepest insights, new insights that we have. in history are turned up by that kind of approach. Gordon Wood, the Brown University, a great scholar of the early American Republic and the American Revolution, has observed that, for lack of a better term, popular historians depend on the work of academic historians, while the reverse is not necessarily true, and I think that's true. Comparing these two approaches directly is like asking what's a more useful tool, a hammer or a wrench? Well, you need more information. What's the job you're trying to do? At its best, I think the narrative style actually accomplishes something that the more clinical approach cannot achieve, which is that it brings us closer to the way that history was actually lived by the people who were there, and therefore brings us to a richer and fuller and more satisfying way of understanding why decisions were made. In history, whatever else it is a genre of literature. It always has been. Back to ancient times, Herodotus, Thucydides, Plutarch, Sallust, Tacitus, and more recently Edward Gibbon, Henry Adams, Winston Churchill, they were storytellers. Theodore Roosevelt, who was a historian of the first rank himself, among all the other things he was, once said that he thought the single most important trait for a historian was imagination. That's a very provocative thing to say, isn't it? We who write nonfiction are supposed to stick to the facts. We're not supposed to let our imaginations off the leash. But I think he's got a point. Putting yourself in the shoes, looking through the eyes of people who lived in a different era, it takes a feat of imagination. And there have been great stories written about the Pacific War. Recently, Unbroken has been read, I would hazard a guess, by at least 10 million Americans. The number may be closer to 20. A real blockbuster of a book and a very good book. But it's rare to find narratives that focus on a single individual or story like that, that will convey the vast sweep of a terrible war, to tell the story of the entire conflict and to do it in a way that pulls the reader through the narrative. My purpose is to assimilate into my narrative many different, distinct, contrasting points of view. The high command and the view from the decks and the foxholes and the cockpits, the Japanese and the American points of view, as well as the other allies, the home fronts and the battlefronts. We have had a dearth of good narratives addressing the Pacific War in all of its vast and terrible sweep. I believe I can claim that this trilogy is the first history of the entire Pacific War to be published in at least 25 years, and the first multi-volume history of the Pacific War to be published in Samuel Eliot Morrison's great series, which was published in the 1940s and 1950s. The Pacific War was, by a vast margin, the largest naval war ever waged, and it was in all likelihood, and we can hope, the largest that will ever be waged. It was the only naval war that has been fought in the Pacific, an ocean so large that you could fit all of the world's combined land masses into it with room to spare. It was the only instance in which opposing fleets of aircraft carriers met in battle. There were 5 such battles in the war. It provided the most complete demonstration of the means by which submarines could destroy enemy supply lines. It led to a fundamental revolution in naval doctrines, putting an end to the era of the big gun battleship and establishing carrier aviation and submarines as the principal means of waging war at sea. There's been a tendency, which I think is axiomatic of all military history, to treat warfare on land as the main plot, while relegating naval history to the status of a subgenre. In the case of the Pacific War, I think that approach has done real damage. One only need glance at a map of the Pacific to grasp that the war against Japan was principally a naval campaign and an air campaign, in which the destruction of the Japanese fleet was the basic strategic problem. Marines might seize remote Pacific islands in savage and valorous combat, as they did, but only after being delivered to the beaches and supported by heavy ship-to-shore bombardment. Conquering islands in the Pacific was never a goal in itself, and when an island wasn't needed, it was simply bypassed. Its Japanese occupiers left to wither on the vine, to use the term of our An island was seized only when it was needed as a new sea or air base, with an airstrip carved out of the jungle and a harbor blasted out of the coral to allow the fleet and the bombers to consolidate their strength and to prepare for the next westward thrust. Any big historical narrative dealing with the Pacific War, in my view, should have the naval campaign at the spine of the narrative. I've worked in that spirit. The Pacific War was an amphibious war, indeed the largest, most technologically complex, the bloodiest amphibious war in history. Amphibious war, striking an enemy on land by way of sea, is the most difficult, most precarious, most risky type of any major military operation. And prior to the Second World War, the largest, most relevant precedent was the Gallipoli campaign in the Dardanelles, which had been a debacle and had very nearly destroyed the career of Winston Churchill. It gave very little reason for confidence. In order for an amphibious operation to succeed, the attacker must have overwhelming advantages. He must control the sea around the island. He must control the air above. He must deliver troops to the beaches very rapidly so that they can build up a critical mass of numbers quickly. But then those troops on that beachhead will have to be supplied constantly, constant support by sea and by air. Amphibious warfare, by its very nature, required the closest, most intimate cooperation between the different services, between the Army, the Navy, the Marines, between the different departments or arms within the services. And for that reason, it exposed and it exacerbated all of the latent inter-service rivalries and antagonisms which exist in every country among military institutions. Prior to World War II, the United States military was not well prepared to function in an integrated high command. The Army, the Navy had interacted very little in peacetime. Consider there was no Department of Defense until after the war. There was a War Department, which handled the Army affairs, and there was a Navy Department. They were each headed by a civilian cabinet secretary who were co-equal and reported directly to the president. There was no such thing as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That committee was convened as a sort of ad hoc response to the need for some sort of organization immediately after Pearl Harbor, particularly to meet with the British when they came over for the first wartime summit to Washington. The Joint Chiefs of Staff never had any statutory authority during the Second World War. It never had an official chairman. The service chiefs, George Marshall for the Army, Ernest King for the Navy, did not have any means of rectifying or resolving their disputes. There was no mechanism. They either hashed it out in direct negotiations or they were obliged to appeal that dispute directly to President Roosevelt. And for many reasons, they didn't want to do that. So they were forced to work together. Consider the technological changes that had happened in the course of these officers' careers between 1900 and 1905, when the senior generals and admirals who fought the Pacific War had entered the service academies. This was before the Wright brothers had got off the ground. There was no aviation when they had started their careers. Radio was in its infancy. It had never been used at sea prior to their beginning their careers. Submarines were primitive contraptions that usually killed the crews and didn't do any damage to the ships that they attacked. The ships were powered by coal and had to make the ship to oil. The pace of technological change that occurred just over the course of these individuals' career really makes your head spin, and that, I think, makes it all the, certainly in me arouses all the more admiration for the quality of American military leadership in that war. The Pacific War, as I've said, was exposed all sorts of frictions between the Allied coalition. Big decisions about the Pacific War tore at the seams of the Allied relationship between the British government, the American government. It pitted the Americans against the British, the Army against the Navy against the Marines, the Air Force against the Army, and against the Navy aviation arm. It pitted General Douglas MacArthur against everyone who did not share his view that he should immediately receive more troops and ships and airplanes regardless of what was happening elsewhere in the world. And there was in 1942 a Solomon-like decision to divide the Pacific between the Army and the Navy. And for that reason, you had two feeders. MacArthur, who is a complicated person and whose star, I think, has fallen further since the height of his career than any other major figure of that era in the eyes of historians, very deliberately used a public relations and media strategy to try to bring pressure to bear against Washington to send him the assets he needed to wage his campaign, which led to the Philippines and then to Tokyo. Allocation to MacArthur's theater became a point of attack in the 1944 presidential campaign, which was really an astonishingly bitter campaign, given that it was fought during, indeed, at the height of the Second World War. Political and partisan passions were remarkably intense during the Second World War. And this is something I think that is often forgotten, certainly in World War II histories. FDR himself, he liked to repeat a joke that had circulated in Washington about the Marines on Guadalcanal. One Marine told another, well, if you'd like to, and the original version of the joke was, if you want to get a Jap, but I won't say that, I'll say, if you want to kill a Japanese soldier, what you do is you walk up that hill and you shout, "To hell with Hirohito, the Emperor of Japan." And then one of the Japanese soldiers will pop his head up and you shoot him. And so the Marine said, all right, I'm going to try that. So he walked up the hill. "To hell with Hirohito." Nothing. Louder. "To hell with Hirohito." Japanese soldier pops his head up and says, "To hell with FDR." So the Marine slings the rifle over his shoulder and walks back down the hill. And his buddy says, "Well, what happened? I didn't hear a shot." And the Marine says, "Well, I know we're supposed to win this war, but I'll be damned if I'm going to shoot another Republican." I repeated that joke at the Naval Observatory, which is the official residence of the Vice President, during the previous administration. And I realized as the punchline left my mouth that Vice President Cheney had actually recently shot another Republican in a hunting accident. And my first thought was, I've insulted my host, and that's not polite. And my second thought was, I might be eating breakfast at the Cafe Guantanamo tomorrow morning. There have been an enormous number of FDR biographies, more of a year. I'm amazed at how much continues to appear in print about FDR. Also quite a bit about MacArthur. These political biographies tend to focus on these political dimensions which I've been discussing, while neglecting the drier considerations of military strategy. In 1944, during the presidential campaign, FDR traveled to Oahu to meet with MacArthur and Nimitz and other senior commanders in the Pacific, and they confronted a whole series of decisions about how to fight the last phase of the Pacific War. But the immediate decision was, do we liberate all of the Philippines, particularly the island of Luzon, the big northern island, which is the location of Manila. MacArthur, of course, wanted to do that. He argued that they had been promised a liberation. The Navy preferred to take a more direct course toward Japan and to continue the logic of bypassing positions, which had worked well in the past. MacArthur won that argument, and these political historians and biographers tend to forcefully emphasize the political dimension of that decision. Well, minutes weren't kept of the key meetings between MacArthur, Nimitz, and FDR. But when we look at staff studies and communications between these military commanders before and after this conference, what we find is that this alternative to go to Formosa, which was the Operation Causeway, Ernest King's favorite alternative to liberating all of the Philippines. The more they looked at that alternative, the worse it looked. And the Japanese army's rampages through the continent of China that had occurred in the same period of time had increased the risk. So, as not very sexy as it sounds, I think MacArthur won that argument on the merits, and this is a point I'm going to make in my third volume. I wanted to, since we're on MacArthur, just close with a few remarks on Japan. When MacArthur was fired by Harry Truman and recalled to the United States, he went before the Senate and was asked in the course of his questioning what he thought about the future of Japan. And he said that measured by the standards of modern civilization, Japan would be like a boy of 12. Now, to our ears, that's a put down. When you call another country a 12-year-old boy. To Japanese ears, it came a bit differently. The relationship between an older brother and a younger brother is a very important concept in the Confucian ideals that are at the heart of Japanese culture. In a sense, MacArthur, who was held in adulation by the Japanese in that period, was offering on behalf of the United States to play the role of an older brother, which is tantamount to offering a kind of familial bond. You would offer guidance, the younger brother should be obedient, but at the same time the older brother also has obligations to the younger brother. And so in the Confucian context, and this may be another way of thinking about MacArthur's peculiar genius, that was a tantamount to a model, and that was used by two generations of Japanese leaders to think about their relationship with the United States. Yukio Mishima, a novelist, a prominent post-war Japanese novelist, said on NHK radio shortly after MacArthur's remark, "I had thought that Japan was an old country that now needed a cane to walk, so I was happy that some famous American kindly pointed out that it's only 12 years old. Among the words Americans have bestowed upon Japan, this one has delighted me the most." And he went on to point out that under criminal law in Japan, as well as in the United States, no one under the age of 14 has the ability to take on criminal responsibility. So the Japanese war criminals were akin to boys who had accidentally killed their friends while playing at war. Well, all of this is just a long-winded way of coming up to my point, which is that when I was a 12-year-old boy, I lived in the heart of Tokyo. My father was in the banking industry, represented his bank there. I spent the formative years of between 11 through 14 living in the heart of that city. And Tokyo then, and still now I think, is remarkable for a number of reasons, one of which it has virtually no violent crime at all. This was a society in which a purse snatching, in which the victim was not harmed, might lead the evening news in the late 70s. And because of that really extraordinary level of safety, all of the foreign or gaijin kids basically had the run of the city. We were allowed to just go off and enjoy ourselves, and had an extraordinary degree of freedom in a city of 20 million halfway around the world. For me, in that period, Tokyo was home. It was my city. And when I travel back to Tokyo and walk around my neighborhood, I still know it like the back of my hand. It will always be my home. And the freedom that we had then led, I'm ashamed to say, to a certain amount of hooliganism. But as Mishima pointed out, no criminal responsibility can be attached to the behavior of a boy that age. Even then, as I've spent these last many years researching this war, I've tried to sum it up from my memory. What did we think about the history of the Second World War? Well, I think the answer basically is we didn't think much about it at all. We were kids, and kids don't think about history. The war had ended 35 years earlier. Of course, to a 12-year-old, that is an eternity. It might as well be 3 centuries. But we did have awareness. We did watch movies like Tor, and Bridge Over the River Kwai. Returning to the United States, we sometimes would meet older Americans, veterans, people from the World War II generation who would express these very bitter sentiments about the Japanese, which was an eye-opener. And of course, in school, we were taught a little bit about the war. 1979, 1980, Japanese middle-aged and older had vivid recollections of the war, although very few ever talked about it. Every now and then we got a glimpse. There was a little shop that sold fireworks in our neighborhood. It was run by a war veteran. He didn't like to sell fireworks to the Gaijin kids. He didn't fight his war for Japan only to sell light munitions to the sons of the occupiers. Sort of understand his point of view, but we didn't appreciate being racially profiled in that way, so we would take the correct amount of money and run in and drop it on the counter and grab the fireworks and run out down the street. He'd come to the door and shake his fist and shake our fist back at him. And my brother, using some of those same fireworks, burned a tree down in a public park, which is a crime there, as it is here, of course, and almost got the entire family deported. I think my father had to make a call to someone in the foreign ministry to smooth that one over. We learned some of the history in school, and we were particularly, I remember clearly, very interested in the subject of our POWs and the way that the Japanese had treated our POWs. Very hard to rectify stories of that kind of cruelty with the impression that we had of the Japanese, which is that they were a very sweet, kind, pacifist people. The sort of consensus explanation for why that had occurred was that the Japanese didn't believe in surrender, and therefore they thought any soldier of any other nation that had surrendered had lost his honor and therefore had given up any rights to be treated with any sort of respect. Well, of course, that's a terrible explanation, but that's what we were told, that it was all just sort of a big misunderstanding. And of course, then there was the issue of the atomic bombs, and like kids here, and in fact, really Americans of three generations since the Second World War, we've been treated to this myth, I think it's fair to say, that there were only two options, either invading or dropping a bomb on a Japanese city without any warning at all. Of course, that's not true. Those were not the only two options. There were other options as well. First big historical narrative I read was The Rising Sun by John Toland, which came out in the mid-70s and which all of the Gaijin parents were reading. I picked it up and I surprised myself, and I think my parents got zooming through it in about a week. And the description of the firebombing of Tokyo in May 1945 seared into my mind in a way that's vivid to recall even now. This was a description of utter devastation across the heart of the city, including the neighborhood that we lived in, and affecting places that I knew intimately and personally. That was the first big historical narrative I ever read, and it began the lifelong fascination with the Pacific War that has eventually led to this book. And I want to just finish by saying that I think the current situation in Japan with regard to these issues of the way the Japanese remember or choose not to remember the Second World War is a matter of great concern. I had always assumed that as the wartime generation passed on, that these issues in Asia would begin to recede in importance, and surprisingly, deplorably, I think the opposite seems to be happening. These issues, particularly between China and Japan, the two Koreas and Japan, are very much at the heart of relations between the major powers of East Asia, and appear to be an important consideration for the future, which affects, of course, American security commitments in the region. The Chinese government is duplicitous in complaining about crimes that took place 75 years ago when you consider their human rights record of today, their behavior in Tibet, many other issues. But the anger that Chinese people, including Chinese Americans, feel toward Japan because of the history of that war is real, and indeed it is justified. What so many people have forgotten is that Japanese forces had behaved very well in the Russo-Japanese War. In the first Sino-Japanese War, in the Boxer Rebellion, Japanese forces had been disciplined. They had treated prisoners according to the highest standards, Red Cross standards. They had protected civilians. They had performed military honors when Russian prisoners had died. The mortality rate among Russian prisoners was extremely low. These events happened just 35 years before the Second World War. That's a period short enough that you had young officers in the First War who were still in the service in the Second War. So something extraordinary happened to change the culture. And I've asked many Japanese, many scholars and political leaders why that happened, and there are different explanations. In the heart of it, I think it's a bit of a mystery. So I have suggested to many Japanese that a better way to go about talking about these issues is to say these things that happened within a 15-year period between 1930 and 1945. We are not proud. We are indeed ashamed of the behavior of our forces. But we don't think that an ancient civilization, 2,700 odd years old, deserves to be judged based on a 15-year period. In a sense, to plead temporary insanity. And I think I may have gone over time a bit, so I'm going to just close very quickly by reading the last paragraph of my book. This is to hammer home the point and the theme which I intend to develop even more in the third volume, which is that the Japanese people were victims of the Japanese regime as well. Direct defiance of authority was impossible. Spies were everywhere, and the Kempeitai, the state security service, was quick to arrest anyone suspected of holding left-wing or anti-Kokutai views. Children were encouraged to inform on their parents and teachers. Libraries were compelled to produce lists of titles loaned to every patron, and the police combed those lists for clues of who might harbor foreign sympathies or unacceptably liberal tendencies. The regime committed an atmosphere of omnipresent paranoia. Traitors and infiltrators were said to be everywhere. During those years, everything happened behind heavy doors, out of our sight, wrote the novelist Michio Takayama, author of Harpa Burma After the War. What's become clear now was wholly unclear then. Day after day, we simply trembled in fear, struck dumb with astonishment at incomprehensible developments. Malnourished and overworked, driven like a herd of beasts, instructed how to act and what to think, deprived of any sound basis for rational judgment, threatened with torture and prison at the first divergence from enforced norms, the Japanese people were powerless to alter the doomed course chosen by their leaders. Having long since surrendered whatever rights and freedoms they had once possessed, they were fated to share in the coming Demarum of 1945. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions.
During that temporary insanity period when they behaved so different than they had 35 years ago, I tend to, maybe this is being too romantic, but I tend to think there must have been one person that dominated thinking for that 15-year period.
I don't think that's the case. The Japanese tend to do things as a group. And groupthink is a very powerful force in Japanese society. It always has been throughout Japanese history. So, during the war, our propaganda tended to try to personify somebody in Japan. We couldn't decide whether it should be Tojo, who was the prime minister and the war minister, or perhaps Hirohito, the emperor. There wasn't quite a Mussolini or a Hitler. We used Tojo as a stand-in, really, but it was a clique, a militarist clique, concentrated in the army, or rather factions within the army, but also drawing Japanese in from other walks of life as well. I think it would be hard to put it onto one individual.
Yeah. Yeah, just towards the end there, you're talking about the options we had about bombing Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and then you went into the burning of Tokyo. Can you say a few words about what were those options? What were the other options?
Well, we had established essentially a complete blockade of the Japanese islands, cutting off their seaborne supply lines to their essential resource areas, putting them into a situation in which their economy, war economy, civilian economy could not function at all. Germany, of course, had been defeated. The Potsdam Declaration coming from Potsdam, south of Berlin. Very strong statement, you're alone. You're going to lose regardless. Surrender. I think you could have waited. I think you could have announced that we had this power. Simply saying we've tested this bomb in New Mexico. Here's a photograph. That alone, I think, even if it hadn't changed the Japanese calculus, it would have achieved something else. It would have shifted part of the responsibility onto the Japanese regime for what then happened later. Another myth, and a lot of this is I'm exploring now in my research because I don't address it in this book. It will be addressed in the next book. But another myth, I think, that has come down to us is that the American people and the American leadership was unanimous, virtually unanimous, about the way that we use the bombs. That's not true. Even in senior ranks of the military services, there were bitter critics of this decision. And so there were a variety of different decisions. I do agree that if the decision came down to invade the Japanese home islands or use the bomb, you can make a case, a convincing case, in my view, for using the bomb against the Japanese based on a kind of Benthamite, Millsian, utilitarianism type of moral reasoning, the greatest good for the greatest number, essentially. But this notion that we either were to invade and kill 20 million Japanese civilians, perhaps lose 500,000 of our own, or drop the bombs without warning on a Japanese city, those were not the only two options. And I'm going to argue that point in the book to come. Yes, ma'am.
When you think of World War II and you look at the treatment here in the United States of the Germans and the Japanese and basically the dehumanizing of the enemy concept, do you think that that had any significance in the decision-making process for bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Well, I mean, certainly hatred, the hatred of the peculiar bitterness of that war certainly was at the heart of the bombing of cities. But we had firebombed German cities as well. And I think it's certainly conceivable that we could have used the bomb against Germany had the war developed differently. So I don't find persuasive the idea that we wouldn't have used the bomb against Germany and that we used it against the Japanese because they're Asians. But this whole notion of hatred and war is a fascinating one, isn't it? Dehumanization of the enemy perhaps is necessary. Taking an 18-year-old kid off of a farm in Idaho, putting a rifle in his hand and telling him to go fight a battle as awful as Peleliu, for example, or Okinawa or Iwo Jima, that young man doesn't naturally come to do what he has to do. Hatred can be a compelling force, perhaps a necessary force. Dehumanization of the enemy, as awful as it is, I think was perhaps a necessary feature of the Pacific War. But it was every officer's responsibility to arrest the descent into bestiality which could follow. And in some cases, I think our leaders let our troops down in that respect.
Can you talk a little about your writing process? These are obviously massive works. Where do you begin? How do you pull your research together?
Yeah, thank you. I try to begin with an outline, and I try to organize the research into a chapter by chapter, section by section, even paragraph by paragraph outline. Of course, that has to be an iterative process because as you do the research, the outline changes. But I try to capture the research in a way that will allow me to put my hands on it right when I need it. That middle part, I think, it's not just research and then write, it's organizing the research before you begin to write, I think is perhaps the most important part of the process. So I'm sorry if that's a bit vague,
Yeah.
but
No.
this could be a very long conversation. And
Just trying to picture how you even go about this.
Yes, ma'am.
You didn't mention anything about kamikazes.
Yeah.
And my father was a World War II naval aviator in the Pacific Theater, first generation German by birth.
Mm.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And gosh, now I forgot what I was going to say. What? Kamikaze, yeah. And I remember some stories because a lot of the he had the Distinguished Flying Cross. So a lot of the people, the recipients, they didn't live. They died.
That's right.
And so they didn't usually speak of it. And so I would always hear, it was always kind of filtered from my mother, but the kamikazes were just like so significant. I mean, they didn't have the radar at the time that we have today, and it would just be, like the alarms, all hands on deck, I mean, the devastation, of our fleets, the kamikazes. And I mean, did you, in any of your books, have you really kind of gone into, since you do have a very interesting insight in terms of the Japanese mind, do your books just add that component and that level of understanding?
Well, the Japanese resorted to suicide tactics after the fall of Saipan in the Marianas campaign of mid-1944. So in other words, right after the period that's covered in this volume was when the Japanese first began considering this use of human beings as guided missiles, essentially, on a massive scale. Began just after this. So I will get deep into that subject in the third volume. But in general, the Japanese warrior code exalted to an even greater degree than our warrior code death in combat. And for many Japanese warriors, in this final phase of the war, when it was clear that Japan had been defeated, at least in a military strategic sense, many warriors of many different ranks then seemed to become preoccupied with how am I going to die? And it's necessary for me to die. And the last thing I'm going to do, I can't save my country, I can't win this war, but I'm going to die well. And so certainly cultural factors are very much at work. And I think it is, one could imagine a situation where young American men committed themselves to suicide attacks on that kind of scale, but it would take a foreign invader coming onto our soil. It would have to be that desperate.
Look at Iwo Jima.
Certainly, but to go deliberately knowing you're going to die rather than to take the risk, that's a step, an extra step. And I think one could, if you use your imagination, imagine a situation in which large numbers of young American men would make that decision, a very heroic decision to give their lives knowingly. But it would have to be at the last extremity, with an invader coming onto our soil.
There's one more.
What do you think about the idea that the decision to commit to total war, to firebombing civilian populations and everything, was actually an Allied decision more than the Axis of the Japanese?
Well, certainly, I mean, because the British had suffered under that kind of punishment from the air in 1940, and subsequent to that. Certainly they had a point of view that the Germans are going to get it. They're going to get the same kind of treatment back from us. But there was Richard Rhodes' book on the atomic bomb is very good at showing how there was, in terms of the moral reasoning behind this, there was a step-by-step. You're going to get the munitions plants. Well, the workers live in the adjacent neighborhoods, so some of those bombs are going to miss the aircraft plant, but they're going to fall into a neighborhood where they maybe will kill some of the workers. And then perhaps we should just take out all of those neighborhoods around the plants, and on and on and on to the point where you had these decisions to simply wipe entire cities off the map. Horrifying, but has to be understood in the peculiar context of this most terrible war in history. Yes.
One more, yeah.
Yeah, there's been some speculation that Roosevelt's, toward the end of the period of this book, Roosevelt said we're going for unconditional surrender. And there's been some speculation that extended the European war. Do you think it had an impact?
So what was that last part?
There's been some speculation that it extended, an argument about that it extended the European war.
Right.
Do you think it impacted the Pacific War?
Yeah, I think it did. Absolutely. Roosevelt, and I get a little bit into the way Roosevelt made decisions. He was a brilliant leader, great president. He was often a real disaster as an administrator. Would make decisions without talking to his advisors, would make them off the cuff, would refuse to make decisions when decisions were needed, and then would suddenly make sweeping decisions that weren't very well thought out. And that was an example. It was at the Casablanca Conference in early 1943, where he simply blurted out in front of newsmen, we're going to accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. And if you look at the footage, you can look at the expression on Winston Churchill's face and say, well, we haven't talked about that, and that could be a mistake. But of course, once the words had been said, they couldn't be taken back. It was a gift to the propagandists on the other side who said, well, what does unconditional surrender mean? It means that they're going to come in and basically enslave us. So therefore, we have to fight to the end. On the other hand, if the Allies had pushed for unconditional surrender in 1918, 1919, perhaps the Second World War wouldn't have had to have been fought. So that's the counterpoint. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, can I ask you about the concrete type? What do you cover necessarily? Are you covering the naval battles, or do you cover the Battle of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf?
Yes,
Do you
ma'am.
cover
Not Leyte Gulf, but the Philippine Sea. Yes.
the one in October 1944?
That one will come in the next volume.
one?
Yeah, so it's a 3-book series. The first one is really just the first 6 months of the war. The surprise strike on Pearl Harbor to the devastating American counterpunch of the Battle of Midway, and also quite a bit on the background of the war and things that had happened earlier. This is the heart of the war, between June 1942 and July 1944, really ending with the Marianas Campaign and the Battle of the Philippine Sea.
So then your next book will be Leyte Gulf, and then will you cover the land war in the Philippines?
To some extent. To some
MacArthur's
extent.
Landing?
To some extent.
That's your next book?
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
On Saturday, October 24th, if anybody's interested, there is a conference on World War II in the Philippines. It's at the San Francisco Main Library.
That's right, I saw that.
And so I'm one of the co-chairs of it.
Okay, what is the date again? I'll repeat it.
October 24th from
October?
10. October 24th.
That's a Saturday?
It's a Saturday.
October 24th at 10 o'clock.
It starts at 10:30 and ends in the afternoon.
And it's at the main branch of the
Yes.
San Francisco
Yes.
Public Library in the Civic Center. So try to make that.
Thank you, Ian.